For 8 years, the boy touched his ear. Every specialist said the same thing. Nothing we can do. His father spent millions, crossed oceans, begged the finest medical minds on earth to look again. They all walked away. Then a maid, a woman hired to clean his floors, noticed something every one of those experts had missed. And what she pulled out of that child's ear with her bare yellow gloves will leave you absolutely speechless. Harold Bronson was a billionaire. Private jets, a 40-acre estate, more wealth than most families see across 3 generations. But his son George was born deaf, 8 years old, never heard a single sound, not his father's voice, not his own name, not the tick of a single clock. Harold tried everything: Johns Hopkins, Zurich, Seoul. Specialists who charged $5,000 before they even sat down. But they ordered tests, scans, second opinions on the second opinions. And every single one of them delivered the same cold verdict, the same rehearsed sympathy, the same 2 words that felt like a door being slammed shut. Irreversible. Accept it. But Harold Bronson could not accept it. Because George wasn't just his son. George was the only thing left of the woman Harold had loved. His wife Eleanor had died the night George was born. So Harold kept searching, kept writing checks, kept getting on his knees in that enormous silent mansion and begging for an answer that never came. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the answer wasn't going to arrive in a white coat. It was going to arrive in an apron. Pamela Reese was 29. No medical degree, no credentials beyond a steady hand and an honest eye. She took the job at the Bronson estate for one reason. Her younger brother's rehabilitation bills were due, and the rent wasn't going to pay itself. She wasn't there to save anyone. She was just there to clean. But Pamela noticed something about George that 8 years and a small fortune in specialists had completely overlooked. Something in his ear. Something dark. Something alive. And one evening, while Harold was away at a board meeting across the city, Pamela Reese pulled on her yellow rubber gloves, crouched down to eye level with a little boy who had never heard her voice, and made the kind of decision that changes everything. What she pulled out of that child's ear in the next 60 seconds would either give George back his world or cost Pamela everything she had. What happened in that hallway? You need to see it for yourself. But first, before we go any further, let me paint you a picture of the world George Bronson grew up inside. The Bronson estate sat behind iron gates at the edge of a Connecticut hillside. From the road, it looked like something cut from a magazine. Georgian columns, windows that caught the afternoon light and scattered it like gold across manicured hedges, sprawling lawns that stretched so far the gardeners used golf carts to cross them. But inside those walls, the house was a different thing entirely. Silent, completely, relentlessly silent. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. This was the silence of a home that had forgotten how to be a home, heavy, thick, draped over every corridor like a second skin. The staff moved through it without speaking. Footsteps were soft. Doors were closed gently. Voices, when absolutely necessary, were kept barely above a whisper. Because Mr. Bronson had made one rule that overruled all others: keep it quiet. No music, no television, no laughter echoing off the marble floors. Harold told himself it was for George. That sound only reminded the boy of everything he could not access. But the truth Harold buried under board meetings and charitable donations and very expensive scotch, was that the silence was for him. Because every sound in that house reminded Harold of a voice he would never hear again. Eleanor's voice. Most evenings, Harold sat alone in his study on the second floor, a glass in his hand, his eyes fixed on the portrait above the fireplace. She was there, frozen in oils, her dark hair, her easy smile, her eyes that had always looked at Harold like he was more than he actually was. The artist had captured something, some warmth, some certainty, as if Eleanor had known, even then, that the world was going to be difficult, and had decided to find it beautiful anyway. George had her eyes. That was the thing Harold could barely stand to look at. That piercing, quiet blue. Searching, watchful, always taking in everything the ears could not. Harold would watch his son move through the house like a ghost, tracing the walls with his fingertips, pausing at windows, pressing his small palm flat against the piano no one played. And Harold would feel the familiar crushing weight of it. The helplessness. The rage with nowhere to go. He had given this boy everything money could touch. And it had not been enough. What Harold didn't know, what he couldn't see from behind his grief and his checkbooks, was that George had been trying to tell someone something for a very long time. Every few minutes, without thinking, the boy would raise his right hand and press it gently against his ear. A small gesture, automatic, like breathing. The doctors had noted it in their files and moved on. Habitual self-soothing, one had written. Common in children with sensory processing differences. Not one of them had stopped to ask, what if it isn't habit? What if it hurts? Not one of them. Until the morning Pamela Reese walked through the service entrance with a mop, a bucket, and eyes that actually saw what they were looking at. She had been on the job for exactly 4 days when she saw George wince. It was a small thing. A flicker. The boy was sitting at the kitchen table, turning a paper bird over in his hands. One of the origami figures the housekeeper folded and left for him on rainy afternoons. Pamela was wiping down the countertops behind him. George touched his ear, and for just a fraction of a second, his bright blue eyes went dark with something that wasn't sadness, wasn't longing. It was pain. Pamela's hand slowed on the counter. She had seen that look before. On her brother Marcus, years ago, before anyone figured out what was wrong with him. That specific look, not dramatic, not crying, just a quiet flinch that children make when they've been hurting so long they've stopped expecting anyone to notice. She set down her cloth. She looked at the ear George kept touching. And in the light coming through the kitchen window, pale, winter-thin, all falling at exactly the right angle, Pamela Reese saw something that made her stomach drop to the floor. Something dark, lodged deep in the canal of George's right ear. Not quite still. Not quite nothing. Her mouth went dry. Her hands went cold inside the yellow gloves. She knew immediately, with a certainty she could not explain and did not question, that what she was looking at was not a medical mystery. It was a medical failure. And she also knew, with the same cold, quiet certainty, that if she touched that child's ear without permission in Harold Bronson's house, she would be fired before sunset. Possibly sued? Possibly worse. Harold Bronson was not a man who handled surprises well. But George pressed his hand against his ear again, and winced again, and went back to his paper bird as if pain was just another thing you learned to carry quietly, like everything else in this house. Pamela Reese made a decision. She didn't make it loudly. She didn't make it dramatically. She just made it. The way you step in front of a car that's heading for a child, you don't think. You just move. She crouched down beside George, level with his eyes. He turned to look at her. Startled, watchful, those blue eyes measuring her the way children measure adults they haven't decided to trust yet. Pamela pointed gently to his ear, then to her own. Then she raised her eyebrows. A question, nothing more. George stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, so slowly, it nearly broke her heart. He nodded. Pamela pulled on her gloves, leaned in carefully. And what her fingers found inside that child's ear, dark, segmented, moving faintly even now, was something no scan had ever caught, no specialist had ever checked for, and no amount of money had ever thought to look at. The sound George Bronson heard next was the first sound he had heard in 8 years. And the man standing in the doorway, Harold Bronson, home 3 hours early, still in his suit, his face going white as paper, was about to find out that the doctors he trusted with his son's entire life had not been trying to heal George at all. What was in the ear? What did Harold do when he saw the blood on Pamela's gloves? And what happened to the specialists when the truth came out? Stay with me. This story is just getting started. Harold Bronson had not always been a man who loved silence. There was a time, a different life, it felt like now, when he had filled every room he entered. Laughter that arrived before he did. Music turned up too loud on Sunday mornings. A wife who threw her head back when something was truly funny and made a sound like the world had just gotten lighter. That was before. Now the Bronson estate ran on quiet the way other houses ran on electricity. It was the first thing new staff learned. Not the security codes, not the house rules printed on laminated cards in the staff kitchen. Those came later. What they learned first, on the very first day, was the silence. How to move inside it. How to become part of it. Soft shoes on marble. Doors eased shut, never clicked. Conversations, when unavoidable, he held close to the chest like something fragile. Mr. Bronson liked things quiet. No one questioned it out loud. They understood the way staff in houses like this always understood. Through inference, through the careful reading of a man's posture and the particular way he went still when a sound reached him unexpectedly. A dropped tray once, in the east corridor. Harold had appeared in the doorway within seconds, not angry, not shouting, something worse than that. Just standing there with that look on his face, the one that said the world had intruded somewhere it was not welcome. The housekeeper, Mrs. Delvaux, ran a tight operation. She told new hires that Mr. Bronson worked from home most days and valued concentration. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also not the true one, and the true one hung above the fireplace in the second-floor study, a portrait, oil on canvas, of a woman with dark hair and a smile that belonged to someone who had never once considered the possibility of leaving. Her name had been Eleanor. She had died 8 years ago in a hospital room 2 floors above where her son had drawn his first breath. Harold had been in both rooms within the same hour. He had held his wife's hand as she went still, and then he had walked, slowly, like a man learning to use his legs, down the corridor to the glass window of the neonatal ward, and he had looked at the boy. He had not known, in that moment, what he felt. He still didn't, if he was truthful with himself. He had named the boy George. Eleanor had chosen it. It was the only thing left of her plans. George was 8 now. He had never heard a sound. Not his father's voice saying his name for the first time. Not the music Harold no longer played. Not the silence itself. Which at least would have told the boy something. That the house he lived in was holding its breath. Had been holding it for years, and did not yet know how to exhale. Harold watched his son sometimes from the study doorway. George moving through the hallways with that particular careful attention of his. Touching the walls lightly, pausing at windows, watching the light move. A boy navigating the world through every sense he had left. He was not sad exactly. That was the thing that undid Harold most. George did not know enough of what he was missing to grieve it. He simply was. Present, watchful, quietly alive in a house that had forgotten how to be. And Harold, who could have filled that silence 100 different ways, kept it instead. Because the silence was the shape of Eleanor now. And he was not ready, had never been ready, to let the shape of her go. So the house stayed quiet. The staff stayed quiet. The specialists came and went and left their reports on Harold's desk like verdicts. And Harold wrote the checks and stared at the portrait and told himself there had to be an answer somewhere. In some clinic, in some laboratory, in some mind brilliant enough to do what 8 years and a fortune had not yet managed. What he did not consider, what had never once crossed his mind, was that the answer might already be inside his own walls. Wearing an apron, carrying a mop, and starting work on Monday. Pamela Reese had learned early that the world did not hand you much, and that the things it did hand you came with conditions attached. Her mother had taught her that. The rent had confirmed it, and her brother Marcus's hospital bills, still outstanding, still climbing with the quiet aggression of something alive, had driven the lesson home in a way that left no room for argument. She had not applied for the Bronson position because she wanted it. She had applied because the pay was nearly double what the agency's other placements offered, because the hours were structured, and because Mrs. Delvaux had sounded, over the phone, like a woman who expected precision and rewarded it. Pamela could do precision. She had been doing it her whole life. She arrived on a Monday morning, 20 minutes early, in an oppressed black uniform she had ironed the night before, with the kind of attention most people reserved for things that mattered more. She carried her own supplies in a handled caddy, her preferred cloths, her chosen sprays, and at the very bottom, folded neatly inside their own small case, a pair of yellow rubber gloves, thick ones, the kind that meant business. Mrs. Delvaux met her at the service entrance and walked her through the house with the efficiency of a woman who had given this tour many times and had no patience for reactions. The grandness of the place, the columns, the high ceilings, the light falling through windows the size of doors, received no commentary. Pamela offered none. She looked at what she needed to look at and filed it away. The rules were delivered in the same clipped, factual tone. No noise beyond necessary, no music, no phones audible in shared spaces. Mr. Bronson worked from home and kept irregular hours. His study on the second floor was off limits unless specifically requested. The boys' wing was to be cleaned between 9 and 11 in the morning, when George was with his tutor. If George was present in a space Pamela was working, she was to continue her work quietly and avoid engaging him. Mr. Bronson preferred the staff maintain professional distance from his son. Preferred, Pamela noted, not required. She filed that away too. She did not see Harold that first day. She heard him once, footsteps on the floor above, measured and slow, the sound of a man pacing a room he had paced 10,000 times before. She did not see George either, not properly. Just a glimpse at the end of the upstairs corridor. A small figure in a blue shirt, standing at a window with his back to her, perfectly still, watching something in the garden below with the total absorption of a child who has learned to find whole worlds in small things. Pamela watched him for a moment. Then she went back to work. By the end of the first week, she had the house mapped completely, not just its layout, but its rhythms. When Harold took his coffee, which floorboards announced themselves, where the light gathered in the afternoons, and which rooms went cold before the heating caught up. She learned a house the way she had learned everything else, by paying attention without announcing that she was doing so. She learned George, too, slowly, the way you learn something you are not supposed to be studying, or he was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something more visibly diminished, perhaps. Some outward sign of all the years of failed diagnoses and specialists' offices, and what she imagined had been a childhood conducted largely as a medical case rather than a life. But George was none of that. He was curious. He was precise. He communicated with his tutor through a hybrid of basic sign language and written notes, and he did so with an efficiency that suggested a mind that had simply found another route when the expected one was closed. But he was also, and this was the thing Pamela noticed on day 3 and could not stop noticing after, in pain. Not dramatically. He would not have known how to perform pain dramatically. No one had ever taught him to expect it to be witnessed. It was the small version and the private version. Every few minutes, without any apparent awareness that he was doing it, George would raise his right hand and press it gently against his ear. Sometimes just resting it there, sometimes pressing slightly harder, as if applying pressure to something that ached. And occasionally, quickly gone before you could be sure you had seen it. A flinch, small as a blink, over before it registered. Pamela had seen that gesture before. She knew exactly what it meant and what it didn't mean. And what it meant was that something was wrong, and what it didn't mean was habit. She had mentioned it carefully to Mrs. Delvaux on Friday afternoon. Mrs. Delvaux had looked at her with the patient expression of someone managing a new employee's enthusiasm, and explained that George's condition had been thoroughly evaluated by a team of international specialists over the course of 8 years, that Mr. Bronson took his son's health extremely seriously, and that the staff were not expected or required to form medical opinions. Pamela had nodded. She had thanked Mrs. Delvaux for her time. She had gone home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for a long while, thinking about a boy pressing his hand against his ear in an empty corridor, in a house full of people paid to notice nothing. Here's something worth knowing, and it matters to this story more than you might think. Medical gaslighting is what happens when a professional dismisses a patient's real, physical symptoms as psychological, exaggerated, or simply normal. It happens more than medicine likes to admit. Patients, especially children, especially those who cannot advocate for themselves, are sent home with a shrug and a diagnosis that translates, in plain language, to, "We have decided not to look harder." The symptoms don't disappear. The suffering doesn't disappear. It just stops being anyone's official problem. George had been someone's official problem for 8 years. And in 8 years, not one of those officials had thought to ask why a deaf child kept touching his ear. It happened on a Tuesday, 11 days into the job. Pamela was on her knees in the hallway outside the east sitting room, working a stubborn watermark out of the baseboard with the focused patience the task required, when she heard, or rather felt, the particular quality of stillness that meant George was nearby. She had learned to sense him before she saw him. Not through sound, obviously. Through something subtler, a shift in the air, the faint vibration of small feet on old floorboards. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway of the sitting room, maybe 6 feet away, still in his pajamas, though it was nearly 10. His tutor must have called in sick. He was holding a wooden puzzle box, the kind with sliding panels that had to be solved in sequence. And he was working it with both hands, his eyes tracking the movement of each piece with total concentration. Pamela stayed where she was. She did not wave, did not smile. She had learned that sudden gestures startled him if he hadn't registered her presence yet, and she had no interest in startling him. She simply kept still and waited for him to notice her in his own time. He looked up after a moment, saw her, considered her with those blue eyes that seemed to be running some internal calculation whenever they landed on a person. Then he looked back down at his puzzle box. Pamela went back to the baseboard. They stayed like that for a while, companionable almost, in the way of two people who have silently agreed that the other's presence is acceptable. Pamela worked, George worked. The house did its usual impression of a held breath. Then it happened. George set the puzzle box down on the floor beside him, slowly, the way children do when something has interrupted whatever they were thinking about. He raised his right hand, pressed it flat against his right ear, and held it there. Pamela's cloth stopped moving. She watched him. He wasn't performing it, wasn't seeking attention, wasn't making a face for an audience. His expression was the specific blankness of someone waiting out a sensation they have learned they cannot do anything about. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to the middle distance. Then the wince came. Small, a tightening around the eyes, a barely there contraction of his whole face, there and gone in under a second. His hand pressed slightly harder against his ear before dropping back to his side. He blinked, picked up the puzzle box again, continued as if nothing had happened. Because for him, nothing had happened. This was just Tuesday. Pamela sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked. The way she had been trained by years of hard experience to look at things people preferred she didn't examine too closely. She had seen that wince before. Not on a patient, not in a hospital. On Marcus, her brother, 11 years old. 3 weeks before anyone figured out what was wrong. That same careful blankness. That same automatic press of the hand. That same practiced returning to normal, because normal was the only option when nobody was listening. That had been a blockage. Severe. Caught almost too late. Pamela looked at George's right ear. Her eyes were steady. Her chest was not. Because she knew what she was looking at. And she knew, with the cold certainty of someone who has already lived through the version of this story where no one acts in time, that what was sitting in that boy's ear was not a medical mystery. It was a medical failure. And it had been there, quietly stealing his world, for 8 years. The question was what she was going to do about it. Because doing something meant risking everything, and doing nothing. She looked at George's face. Calm, patient, quietly enduring. Doing nothing was no longer something she was capable of. It started with a paper bird. Pamela had found it on the windowsill of the east sitting room, one of the origami figures the housekeeper left for George on slow mornings. A crane, folded from the pale blue paper of an old envelope, its wings caught mid-lift, as if it had been frozen 1 second before escape. She had picked it up carefully, meaning to set it somewhere less precarious, and had turned to find George standing behind her watching. She held it out to him. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at her first, that long, measuring look she was becoming familiar with. And then he looked at the bird, and something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not quite. Something quieter than a smile, a decision. He took the bird, turned it over in his hands, and then he looked back at Pamela and did something unexpected. He held the bird close to his chest, just briefly, wings pressed to his sternum. Then he held it out toward her again. Pamela looked at him, at the bird, at him. She pressed her own hand flat to her chest, raised her eyebrows. Me? He shook his head, held the bird out again, more deliberately, then pointed at her, then brought his finger back to point at himself. Back and forth, you, me, until she understood. Ours. She nodded slowly, and something that had no name settled between them in that room like a third presence, careful, new, not wanting to be startled away. After that, it grew the way quiet things grow, gradually, without announcement. A language assembled from whatever was available. Pamela would touch her own ear and tilt her head. George had learned quickly that this meant, does it hurt today? He had developed his own answer. A flat palm held steady meant manageable. A slow waver of the same hand meant not good. She never pushed past whatever he offered. She simply noted it, filed it, and kept working. He taught her things in return. He had a sign for her specifically, 2 fingers walking across his palm, then a small upward flick. She gathered it meant something like the one who moves through the house. She chose to take it as a compliment. He had a sign for the mansion itself. Both hands pressed together, then slowly pulled apart, like something vast and hollow being measured. He had a sign for his father. One finger pointing upward toward the study, slow and deliberate, carrying a weight she didn't examine too closely. And one afternoon, without preamble, he looked at her directly and brought both hands to rest, open-palmed, one over the other, close to his heart. Then he pointed at her. She didn't know the formal sign, but she knew what he meant. Safe. Pamela looked at this 8-year-old boy who had spent his whole life being handled, assessed, and ultimately set aside, and felt something press behind her eyes that she absolutely refused to let go any further. She brought her own hands together in the same shape, pointed back at him. You too. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Studies consistently show that over 70% of what we communicate to each other has nothing to do with the words we use. It lives in the body, in the tilt of a head, the stillness of hands, on the precise quality of eye contact that tells you whether someone is truly present or simply performing presence. Children like George, who navigate the world without sound, often develop this literacy to a degree that humbles the rest of us. They read the room the way musicians read a score, completely, instinctively, catching what the rest of us miss entirely. Pamela had no formal training in sign language. George had an incomplete one. But between them, in the east sitting room with its afternoon light and its folded paper crane on the windowsill, they had built something that worked. Something honest. And sometimes that is the whole of what communication requires. It was the light that showed her. Not a lamp. Not the harsh fluorescence of an examination room that 8 years of specialists had apparently found sufficient. Just winter sunlight, coming through the tall east window on a Thursday morning at exactly the right angle. Low, direct, unforgiving in the way that only midwinter light can be, stripping everything it touched down to its true condition. George was sitting on the floor beside the window. He did this sometimes. Positioned himself in the patch of light the way a cat would, precisely, deliberately, as though he had calculated exactly where the warmth would be longest. He had the paper crane in his lap. He wasn't folding it or studying it, just holding it, the way you hold something that has become a kind of anchor. Pamela was changing the linens on the window seat behind him. She had been working quietly, as she always did in his presence now. No sudden movements, no vibrations through the floor that might startle him. They had settled into a rhythm in this room, the two of them. It required no management. It simply was. She shook out the second pillowcase and glanced down at him automatically, the way she had trained herself to check on him every few minutes without making it visible. And the light caught it. She went absolutely still. George had tilted his head slightly to the left, something he did when he was thinking, a small, involuntary lean, and the sunlight was falling at a precise, clean angle directly into his right ear. And there, in that merciless winter light, Pamela saw it clearly for the first time. Not a shadow, not a trick of the dark. Something real, or something with dimension and density and color, deep brown-black at its core, darker at the edges, lodged so deep it had made itself at home. It had the horrible, settled quality of something that had been there a long time. Long enough to stop being noticed. Long enough to be written into a medical file as irreversible and left there. Filed away under accepted, under nothing we can do. Pamela's hand tightened around the pillowcase. She did not move. She did not make a sound she wasn't already making. She simply stood and looked. Catalogued it the way her mind had learned to catalog things that required action. Its size, its position, the way it sat not flush, but deep, angled inward, the kind of placement that would not have shown on the surface, and would have required someone to actually look, actually care enough to look, on with eyes rather than just equipment. 8 years. 8 years of world-class medicine, and not one person had held this child up to the light. The crane dropped from George's fingers onto the floor. He reached up, automatically, unconsciously, and pressed his hand against his right ear. Held it. The wince came and went in a second. He picked up the crane, smoothed its wings, carried on. Pamela set down the pillowcase. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not racing. It had gone, strangely, very quiet, the way it did when a decision had already been made, and the rest of her was simply catching up. She looked at her caddy in the corner, at the yellow gloves folded inside their case. She looked at George. She had known since Tuesday 3 weeks ago what she was going to do. She had just been waiting, without admitting it to herself, and for the moment she could no longer pretend she hadn't seen it clearly. That moment was now. The only question left was when Harold Bronson would be far enough away for what came next to happen, without being stopped before it was finished. She thought about Marcus that night. She always thought about Marcus when she was standing at the edge of something that required more courage than she was sure she had. He had been 11. She had been 19. Their mother was working 2 jobs, and their apartment in Bridgeport was the kind of place where you learned early that problems you couldn't afford to fix got carried quietly. Because the alternative, the doctor's visit, the missed shift, the bill that arrived 6 weeks later in a plain white envelope, cost more than the pain did. Marcus had started touching his ear in February, pressing at it the way George pressed at his. The same automatic gesture, the same careful blankness that children develop when they have learned that wincing out loud produces concern that nobody has the time or money to follow through on. Pamela had noticed. She had said something to her mother, who had said they'd look at it once the rent cleared, who had said it was probably nothing, who had said what all exhausted people say when they are doing their absolute best and their absolute best still isn't enough. Give it a week, let's see. They gave it 3 weeks. By the time the school nurse sent him to the hospital with a fever of 104, The infection behind the blockage had been sitting untreated long enough to scare the attending physician into language she was not accustomed to using in front of teenagers. Words like mastoiditis. Words like, if you'd waited another week. Words that Pamela had carried in the pocket behind her sternum ever since. Smooth and heavy as stones. Marcus had recovered. Fully, eventually, after 2 weeks of IV antibiotics and the kind of medical attention that arrives too late, but still, mercifully, arrives. He was 31 now. He had a daughter. He called Pamela on Sundays and complained cheerfully about his daughter's homework and the price of groceries. And he did not remember the February he had spent pressing his hand against his ear, because 11-year-olds are resilient and memory is kind. Pamela remembered for both of them. She sat at her kitchen table that Thursday evening and looked at her hands for a long time. The yellow gloves were in her caddy across the room. She had cleaned with them for 6 hours. Tomorrow she would take them back into the Bronson estate, and she would use them to wipe down countertops and polish fixtures and do all the visible, documented, professionally appropriate things she had been hired to do. Or she wouldn't. The choice had the strange simplicity that choices sometimes achieve when you have already delayed them past the point of comfort. It wasn't complicated anymore. It was just a question of whether she was going to be the person who had learned something from February, or the person who had learned nothing at all. What Pamela was operating on, in those weeks of watching George, cataloging his winces, reading the angle of his head, interpreting the press of his hand, had a name, even if she would not have used it herself. Intuition is not mysterious. Researchers who study how the human brain processes information have found that what we call a gut feeling is almost always the mind doing something genuinely sophisticated, detecting patterns too small or too fast for conscious thought to catch, cross-referencing them against accumulated experience, and arriving at a conclusion before the reasoning brain has finished tying its shoes. Pamela had spent 19 years in proximity to a brother who had an ear problem. She had spent 6 months cleaning houses, where she learned to read rooms and people and the quiet signals they put out. Her brain had taken all of that and handed her a verdict on day 3. She had just needed the light to confirm it. Have you ever had a gut feeling? One of those quiet, certain knowings that arrived before you had any logical reason for it? That turned out to be completely right. The kind that you almost talked yourself out of? Share it in the comments. Because what Pamela did next required her to trust exactly that. The things she knew before she could explain why she knew it. And she was done waiting. Tomorrow, Harold Bronson had a board meeting in the city. He would leave at 7. He would not be back before 3. That was a window. Pamela was going to use it. Harold's car left the drive at 7:04. Pamela watched it from the upstairs hallway window. The black sedan moving down the long gravel path, through the iron gates, gone. She stood there for a moment after it disappeared, her hand resting on the window frame. And then she turned and walked to her caddy and pulled on the yellow gloves. Her hands did not shake. She noted this with something close to gratitude. George was in the east sitting room. He was always in the east sitting room on Friday mornings. She had mapped him as carefully as she had mapped the house, and the east sitting room at 9 o'clock on a Friday was as reliable as anything she knew. She found him on the floor in his patch of light, the paper crane in his lap, his head tilted slightly left. Thinking about something, or nothing. But with George it was sometimes impossible to tell which, and she had come to suspect the distinction mattered less than people assumed. She came around to face him and crouched down slowly until she was at his level. He looked up, registered her. The blue eyes ran their usual quiet calculation. Pamela held up both hands, gloves visible, open-palmed, not hiding what she was going to do. She would not sneak this. If he said no, she would stand up and walk away and find another way, a longer way, a way that didn't require him to let her close. She pointed carefully to his right ear. Then she pressed her own hand flat to her chest, her sign for, I am asking, not taking. Then she held up the gloved hands again and waited. George looked at her hands, looked at her face. The paper crane turned slowly between his fingers. and then he set it down on the floor beside him, very deliberately, as if placing it somewhere safe for later. And he tilted his head to the left, exposing his right ear to the light. Pamela exhaled once, quiet and controlled. Then she leaned in. She worked slowly. She had spent the previous evening reading everything available on oral foreign body removal. The angle of approach, the risks, the technique required when the object was deep and the canal was small, and 8 years of inflammation had built up around it like a border. She knew what she was doing. She knew the 100 ways this could go wrong. She moved anyway, with the particular steadiness of someone who has calculated the cost of inaction and found it higher than the cost of everything else. George held himself completely still. Completely and extraordinarily still, as if some part of him understood what was happening, or at least understood that the person beside him was not going to hurt him, that this was different from the clinical cold of examination rooms, that these yellow gloves belonged to someone who had been paying attention for weeks before she ever reached for him. The blockage gave, not all at once. There was a moment of resistance, horrible, breathless. And then it moved. And Pamela's hand was steady, and her grip was sure, and she drew it free with the care of someone lifting something irreplaceable from a place it should never have been. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in her glove. Dark, segmented. A creature, long dead and desiccated, uncompacted by years into something dense and immovable, that had made its home in a child's ear canal and been missed, year after year, by every expert Harold Bronson's money could reach. She had no words. She did not try to find any. She looked at George. He had gone very still in a different way now. Not the stillness of endurance. Something else. His eyes were wide and fixed on the middle distance, and his lips were slightly apart, and he looked... Stunned was not quite the right word. He looked like someone standing in a room that had just acquired a new dimension, like the world had, without announcement, expanded. Then his gaze dropped, slowly, to the antique clock on the mantelpiece across the room. Tick, tick, tick. His mouth opened. A sound came out of George Bronson that was barely a sound at all. A breath, on a single caught syllable, something between wonder and the total collapse of 8 years of learned silence. His hand came up to his right ear and hovered there, trembling, not pressing this time. Just present, feeling the air move against skin that had never felt it this way. He turned to Pamela. His face was open in a way she had never seen it. No calculation, no careful measuring. Just open, bare. A child. His lips formed a word. She could not hear it either because it was too small, barely voiced, his first real attempt at organizing the sounds that were now, suddenly, astonishingly, reaching him. But she could read it. Dad. Pamela Reese pressed her yellow-gloved hands together in her lap and let the one tear go that she had decided she was permitted. Just the one. Then she heard it. Behind her. In the doorway. A sharp, a terrible intake of breath. And she turned. And Harold Bronson was standing there, still in his coat, his board meeting apparently forgotten or abandoned or simply overruled by something she could not know. His eyes moving from the thing in her glove to his son's face, to the tear tracking down her cheek. His face went through several things in quick succession. She watched them arrive and could not stop any of them. The last one was fury. Harold crossed the room in 4 strides. Not running. Harold Bronson did not run. But there was something in the way he moved, contained, compressed, the particular velocity of a man whose entire body has become a single clenched fist. That was worse than running. Pamela rose from her crouch instinctively, putting herself upright, because whatever was coming, she was not going to receive it on her knees. He stopped 2 feet from her. His eyes went to the glove, to the dark, desiccated thing sitting in her yellow palm. His face moved through several things in rapid succession. Shock, confusion, and then something that burned off every other emotion like morning frost in direct sun. What did you do? Not a question. The punctuation was all wrong for a question. I removed a blockage from George's ear canal, Pamela said. Her voice came out level. She was quietly grateful for that. A significant one, lodged deep. It had been there a very long time. Harold's jaw tightened. You touched my son. He said it the way people repeat things that haven't fully landed yet. You are a maid. You put your hands inside my son's ear. Yes. Without my permission. Without any medical. He stopped. The fury was enormous, but he was a man who had built a fortune on the ability to control himself in rooms where control was the only currency that mattered. His eyes dropped again to her glove, to the thing inside it, and something flickered behind his expression. Not softening. Not yet. Nowhere near yet. But a fracture. A hairline crack in the certainty. There is blood on that glove. Pamela looked down. A faint smear, pale pink, onto along the outer edge of the left glove where she had steadied George's jaw. Minor surface irritation from the extraction. The canal had been under pressure for years. It's Mrs. Delvaux. Harold's voice went to the door without his eyes leaving Pamela's face. Mrs. Delvaux, call security. This woman is to be removed from the property. A beat. Now, please. Pamela did not move. She held the yellow glove open between them, the evidence of what she had done, and what had been done, and what 8 years of negligence looked like when you finally held it up to the light. Before security arrives, she said quietly, I need you to look at what I am holding. Really look at it. Because every specialist you have ever paid, every clinic, every procedure, every flight across the world, not one of them found this. And then it was there the entire time. Harold looked. She watched him look. The silence in the room was different from the silence the house usually kept. That silence was managed, maintained, a choice made daily by a man who needed the world muffled. This silence was the other kind. The kind that arrives when something irrevocable has just occurred and everyone present is still catching up to it. The security guard appeared in the doorway. Large, professional, waiting for instruction. Harold stood with his back to the door, still looking at what Pamela held in her palm. His hands were at his sides. Something in his posture had shifted in the last 30 seconds. Imperceptibly, the way a wall develops a crack that isn't visible until it is suddenly, completely, too late to miss. Mr. Bronson? The guard said quietly. Yes, sir. Harold said nothing. From the hallway behind the guard came a sound. Small, uncertain, the sound of someone trying out something entirely new with the equipment available and not yet sure how it worked. A voice, a child's voice, saying one word, rough-edged, effortful, real. Dad. The crack in Harold Bronson's wall became something else entirely. Something that had no word in the language of men who had spent 8 years holding themselves together through sheer force of will. He turned slowly toward the door, toward the small figure standing in the hallway light. And the security guard, reading the room with the instinct of someone paid to read rooms, took one quiet step back and said nothing at all. Harold did not call security again. He did not, in fact, say anything for a very long time. He simply knelt on the floor of the east sitting room with his son's arms around his neck and his face pressed into the boy's hair. And he stayed there while George made the small, wondering sounds of someone discovering that the world had a texture he had never been given access to. The tick of the clock, the distant creak of the house settling, the muffled percussion of his own father's breathing, ragged and undone, against the side of his head. Pamela set the yellow gloves down on the windowsill and quietly left the room. She sat in the kitchen for an hour, drinking tea she didn't taste, waiting for whatever came next. And what came next was Harold Bronson appearing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves. At some point, he'd shed the coat, looking like a man who had just survived something he hadn't known he was in the middle of. He sat down across from her without asking permission and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment before he looked at her. Tell me, he said, exactly what you found and exactly what it means. So she told him. All of it. The wince she had first noticed on day 3, the pattern she had tracked, what she had seen in the light, what she had recognized from her brother's history, what she had removed, and what its presence meant about the nature of George's deafness, and the 8 years of diagnoses that had built a wall of certainty around a lie. Harold listened without interrupting. His face was unreadable in the way of people processing something that requires a complete restructuring of what they believe to be true. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "They knew," he said. Not a question. The particular flatness of a man arriving at a conclusion he does not want. "I can't say that with certainty," Pamela said carefully. "What I can say is that what I found was visible. It was findable. Anyone who looked with genuine attention rather than a prepared conclusion would have found it. Whether that represents negligence or something worse." She stopped. "That's for people with more authority than me to determine." It took Harold 3 days and 1 phone call to his personal attorney to determine that it was something worse. The specialists, 3 of them, networked, referring Harold between themselves in a rotation carefully designed to sustain his hope just enough to keep the appointments coming. Had understood George's condition from year 2. Had understood and chosen the more profitable interpretation of their oath. The legal proceedings that followed were not swift. They were, however, thorough. Harold never spoke of them publicly. He did not need to. He had a different accounting to attend to first, the one that could not be filed in any court, that had no deadline and no settlement figure, and could not be resolved by any attorney alive. He found Pamela in the East sitting room on her last official day. She had already arranged for her replacement through the agency. She had not presumed to stay, and he stood in the doorway, the same doorway where he had arrived in fury 3 weeks before. And he said, without preamble and without the armor of the controlled corporate voice he typically deployed for difficult conversations, "I looked at my son this morning. Really looked at him. For the first time in 8 years, I looked at him instead of looking at his condition." He paused. "You did that. You gave me that." Another pause, longer. "I don't know how to adequately." "You don't need to," Pamela said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something he does not deserve, but is grateful for, nonetheless. George appeared at Harold's elbow, silently, as was his way, a habit that 8 years of navigating a soundless world had made permanent regardless of what he could now hear. He looked at Pamela, brought both hands together, open-palmed, one over the other, close to his chest. Then he pointed at her. "Safe." Pamela smiled, pressed her own hands together in the same shape, pointed back. That evening, Harold sat in the East sitting room. No study, no portrait, no scotch. And George climbed onto the sofa beside him in the easy, unannounced way of children who have recently decided that someone is trustworthy, and pressed his ear flat against his father's chest. Harold went very still. George listened. The heartbeat was steady and strong and entirely unremarkable by any measure that the world outside that room would have recognized as significant. But George had never heard it before. Had spent 8 years in the same house as this sound and never once had access to it. He closed his eyes. The clock ticked on the mantel, as the house creaked its old familiar creak. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the garden Eleanor had planted and never seen fully grown. And inside the silence that had swallowed this family for 8 years, that heavy, thick, grief-soaked silence that had masqueraded for so long as love, something shifted, opened, let the sound in. It was, George would later say, in the careful and deliberate way of someone who had learned language late and therefore chose every word with intention, the most beautiful sound in the world. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was his. If you made it to the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You didn't scroll past a child no one was listening to. You stayed. You cared. And that matters more than you know. So here is what I need from you right now. 3 things, 30 seconds, and it changes everything for this channel. 1. hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. New stories drop every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. 2. Smash the like button. It tells the algorithm this story deserves to be seen by more people, and more people deserve to feel what you just felt. 3. Drop a comment below. Not just any comment. Tell me, did you trust the maid or the expert, and were you right? The next story is already waiting. And I promise you, it is going to be even harder to put down than this one.